But it's not just going on here. There's stuff going on in the UK as well. Would you believe veterans have been told, and army groups, etc., have been told that for Armistice Day, they should remove any kind of Christian remembrance services in order to be inclusive of everybody. Now, look, there are lots of people who have served in the army and the military, both in this country and the US and the UK, of diverse background and diverse religion. I have never heard anyone raise any concern with Christian links between the army and the military and soldiers, etc. But now, of course, again, we have these stupid discussions about how we've got to remove everything that is linked to the West. Now, I'm sorry, what do they think soldiers in World Wars I and II were going out to fight for? They were going to fight for Western values, Judeo-Christian values. And now we have to remove that because it might offend little Johnny over in the corner who doesn't even like Armistice Day anyway.
This is particularly ridiculous in the UK because the King, of course, is also the defender not just of the nation, but the defender of the faith. He's the head of the church. It's a Christian country in every sense. So to say you can't have any Christian prayers or hymns on Remembrance Day because you might upset somebody, though nobody, to our knowledge, has actually complained about anything, is just madness. And so what you've got is and Douglas Murray wrote a brilliant book about this, The Strange Suicide or The Strange Death of the West. He talked about the fact you've got an identity crisis in the West at the very time you've got huge immigration, which that's a disaster in itself. But then you throw in the confidence of Islam, which is moving into the West, and you've got a very dangerous situation. So calls like this just add more fire to an already combustible situation.
And listen to this, the Defence Secretary, the Secretary of State in the UK, so this is Grant Shapps, who is very close to said secretary. He says, the Secretary of State is Jewish and he's not offended one bit by Christian remembrance services. In fact, he believes it's at the core of our nation's history and who we are. You're not wrong. Later in the article, it goes on to talk about how the armed forces in the UK, much like here, we'll get to that later in the papers, are doing a dismal job of recruiting anyone. No one wants to fight for their nation anymore because you have stripped away the national identity to the bare bones and you have made people feel ashamed to be patriotic. They're not allowed to be anymore. And any flogs who actually have a problem with any acknowledgement of God on Armistice Day, I'd love to see you refight those wars without God Almighty on your side. I bet you'd come begging back, baby, because it was no coincidence that they won. They went to war for God and country, and look at the victory that they wrought. Well,
there is that old expression, there's no atheists in foxholes. But I mean, the crazy thing is they're saying, look, we need to be inclusive. We need to be inclusive, but they're deliberately recruiting women and people from ethnic minorities over white males. The head of recruitment of the RAF quit her job because she was being told to do this. And she said, I'm not going to do this. It's not beneficial for the country. It doesn't help our defence force at all. So the very problem they are complaining about, they're actively creating.
And the armed forces have 40 full-time equality officers.
Oh, God
40 full-time equality officers. And you wonder why people are like, I'm not joining this.
And meanwhile, in Australia, we don't even have any drones or anti-drone capability. So you know how good. But again, I ask the question, inclusive of whom? Like, is there actually anyone out there who is offended by a prayer or a hymn on Remembrance Day? I've yet to meet someone. I've been to plenty of dawn services, etc., on Anzac Day and you know, services on Remembrance. I've never met anyone who's offended by this. Again, it's this self-loathing element of the West that gets ahead of itself and tries to tell people that we ought to be offended by it. No one is actually offended by it. All they end up doing is whipping up more division than there was in the first place by creating divisions that don't actually exist.
And the madness is that we're having these conversations in the West. Do you think Xi Jinping is sitting in China thinking we need more diversity? in the
Putin in
Chinese
Russia
Communist
being like,
Army.
you know what we need? More diversity. That's it. All you have to do is watch the ad for Russian recruitment to the army, watch Chinese, similar, and then watch either Australians or Americas, and then you're like, okay. The stark difference is eye-watering.